Oh my god, holy crud. Hi. Everything's screwy today. There was no plugin on Sunday, and here I am live, trying to get my stuff together with new things. I can't tell whether this is working or not, but microphone. My idea here is that I'm going to work out how to do something with that. But for now, new tech and semi-new Q&A question, and my this is not set up. That's good enough, I guess. I'm going to want to set this to top chat so that people don't get like randomly censored by YouTube. Sometimes they deserve to, but whatever. And hi. Also, I'm going to want to bury this big picture of me over there. So, my conversation so far. I'm getting this in case I need to make notes of it, although this is kind of... Man, I've worn everything off of this marker. I'll need a new one before very long. It's no question if it's like running out and stuff. Oh, and the way I'm set up, I can't tell whether the mic is working. Guys, I guess you just have to tell me whether the mic is working or not. Here, let me make a big loud noise of it while pointing it to me. Yep. My hope is that I can do that and get back into the music thing as in tomorrow. So I got a list of stuff to do as far as that's concerned. And I'm going to be trying to fire that up. And just about everything is new with that as well. And the thing about this mic that makes it special is something here. I made coffee. I haven't had a chance to drink any of it. The thing that's special about that, and let me update the Airwindows Q&A. The thing that is special about that is using that mic that I showed you. That's a USB mic that is patched into the I haven't even gotten a chance to hear it. I have no idea what this sounds like at this time. But if I put it in a place where I can sit right close to it and turn it way down to compensate for that, and then do my live jam, and as I usually do, record that to put on SoundCloud. If I do that, I get to talk back to chat, and it doesn't feed into the recording. That means I can do a running commentary on everything that I'm doing for an hour and 40 minutes, roughly. And that means I get to simultaneously do a music jam where I can read chat and talk back to chat using that microphone while recording the music thing without the talkback mic. So it may not work. I mean, if it completely and totally fails to work, maybe I'll just stop doing music again for a while. I haven't done music all of January because I got good and burnt out. And this is a way of getting back in there. And if nobody was interested in my music, which is fine. That's fine. I like to make stuff, and the tools that I fool with for doing with the music is more interesting to people. But if you were interested in it, there's a whole bunch of changes and improvements that I've put in. So there's that. So I've just about lost half of the chat, so let's have a scroll back. No plugin release. That's not technically true. I'm still working on 2-tape and 2-tape 6. And I'm more or less decided with the stuff like that that's important, I'm going to keep working on them until they're right. And we're probably right at this point. But I'm open to commentary on what else is going on there. We may or may not have been talking about kick drums. If we do, I'll replace the Q&A question with that. That can be your orientation factor on what we're doing. Seeing as I've just explained what I'm doing on Tuesday, scroll back is currently where I'm at in the chat. Now, where is Chris? I was trying to get all this together. Had to plug stuff together and make it work. Usually I'm reasonably good about that, but I tell you, sometimes I can't make it at exactly the top of the hour. I'll probably always be able to do this even if I can't do anything else. We'll see. One of the challenging things there is that, being Chris from Airwindows, other stuff piles up. One of the things that was piling up, I never did a thing about this. I probably don't need to. I have my funky light. I didn't turn it on. I'm lucky I remembered to turn the microphone on. This might be entirely too blinding. But, if I adjust my funky light, then yay, I've got that. But there are many more things I work on besides just making the plugins. And if they back up, I start losing my mind. And it's not great. So sometimes I have to put time into working on stuff and even put it out in a way that you can see of it. And that's a problem I'll run into. It's like unclogging a drain. I have to pour the Drano in and unclog my brain because it'll get clogged up with stuff like working on animation systems and watercolor paints and game design and who knows what else. So the current situation with that was I got clogged up a lot in fixing the chord organ stuff for that synthesizer. New cabling and wiring, like my kick drum hat and the snare drum sample, are now running through a proper pre, which is also set up so that now I can flip a switch and record acoustic drums out of my drum room. I have not had time to even make a single recording of that. But the cabling is wired. I had to solder it all together and stuff and build it. And should work, I hope. And I'm not sure how close I am to being able to run headphones up there so I can actually track on anything, which would kind of be important. So more to be revealed there. That's going to take time too. But yeah, that's just kind of the stuff that I have to deal with. So I'm on scroll back. Let me continue the scroll back. Bo keeps saying, what about kicks? I have no idea what you're talking about. What's the issue? No issues at all. That's a thing that could fit into the plugins eventually. That's the name of a plugin. It's not really very good. That's probably not what you meant. Somebody's asking for Nicola. Yeah, that can come. Don't be impatient. Who knows how long that's going to take. It can be on the list. Scroll back, scroll back. Happy to catch the live stream. That's good. Joko Sekovan being sassy. Maybe there will be times when I'm completely enthusiastic about that. This isn't going to be one of those times, but I'll be here with you until like 12:40 or so, regardless. So we'll see how this works. Done with the scroll back. The fellow putting stuff into ULaw is and will always be David Pixley. It's not really that useful as far as plugin set, but it's just stuff you can do with it. I'm going to have to watch out for this new microphone. I have no feedback, no way of telling how it's recording. I've never heard it before in my life. I'm not hearing it now. And so that's going to be an adventure. I'll experience that with I'll experience that hours after the rest of you because I have no idea what I'm getting. I only know that this is a USB mic, so that's going into OBS, and I get to do my recording of other stuff and not include it. And again, that's to see whether that works out for me on Tuesday. It'll be a lot more interactive. For people in chat on Tuesday, I'll have to make the text bigger, much like I do when it's the Wednesday Hangout stream. That's been interesting. Like, nobody's been showing up to that, which is fine. I'm just doing it because I haven't gotten to hang out with my friends in literally years. And so now I do that. But anybody here is still welcome to, like, jump on the Minecraft with us and play, Chris Code in sense of a Minecraft mod. Or jump on the audio chat, and we'll see how that works out. I'm tempted to make the chat larger. Let's go. So, quick update of the Q&A. I so ought to come up with a way of making a live updating file. Right now I'm still having to hit save to make it update. So, still kind of on the scroll back. Vinyl has an observation onto tape 6. Thing, however, is I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. And that's not the way that Console 7 was done. Infinity 528 Affirmation Audios asks, what does analog summing do different from perfect? That's a big question. So firstly, let's see whether I can rewrap it. There we go. Alrighty. So we'll dig into this a little bit, and I'll see what I can do with this. Supposing you have channels, and they are getting combined to mix on a bus into an output. If you've got perfect digital summing, these are samples, and you simply add them together. They are just straight up linear adding. And it's possible to have, let me scooch down a little bit so that I can get in here. It's possible to have analog desks that are so high resolution that they kind of sound and vibe like digital. That is a thing that exists. The guy that I sometimes refer to, Slipperman, is a metal mixer named Tim Gillies. When he was working in New Jersey in his own studio, liked using a Neve desk that was so high performance and so high resolution that it had people thinking that it was digital summing fairly often, because it was just utterly lossless. It was just magical in terms of incredibly high fidelity. That's not necessarily what you want with summing, but if you've got like tone shaping, so it rolls off the highs, right? It rolls off the highs and lows. with that. That's the shape. That's the form of a resistor, but whatever. Then that's not necessarily the same thing as stuff having to do with summing. That's just tone coloring stuff. One thing that can happen with summing, which I think is the case for a lot of different especially older desks, you could have something where this bottom one is very positive and these are very negative. Or you could have one where these two, that's trying to mix a thing where these are positive, these are negative, they equate to 0. If you're summing that, the output is nothing. But if you have analog amplifiers in here so that they can only do so much, like these can clip before getting combined. If you had these summed through really big resistors, then it takes the level down to a very small amount that then has to get amplified up to go into this. And the bigger the resistors, the less interaction these channels will have with each other. And this is not necessarily the same thing as crosstalk, because people consider crosstalk to be sides going into each other, and I don't value that. I don't consider that important. But interchannel, you could say crosstalk, has to do with the fact that these are amplifiers as well as just signals going through here. And if these are very positive and this is trying to be negative, it's trying to pull energy out of the bus, pull it down to negative. And anything bleeding through these channels is going to just make that easier to do. Like the bus impedance is going to be strongly positive. And essentially the way that it works is the individual tracks can set up in such a way where they're interfering with each other. And the bus impedance, or say if these were negative and this one was positive, it could be trying to put a positive signal through to the final output of the bus, but these are so negative that it's pulling extra current out of this amplifier. And if you pull too much current out of the amplifier, it will distort. And if the impedance is excessively low, rather than being a big resistance, it's being made to be a smaller resistance because there's a bunch of energy sucking the information out of this one, then it will distort easier. Like more resistance on the channels, less output, more makeup gain that you need, more noise, but also less interactivity. Less resistance on these, cleaner sound, well, in a sense, with less noise, less makeup gain required, but more interactivity. It is the interactivity part that I'm doing in stuff like console. I'm programming it in such a way where the channels are doing that distortion thing based on what it is they're seeing on the bus. I'm pre-distorting it and then undistorting it on the bus. So anything... no, we're going to get to cable quality eventually. I'm here for you through the entire Q&A thing, but I got a question. It's an incredibly general big question, but this is me trying to do that. So analog summing can show different input impedances to the bus, and modeling that means you're no longer doing perfect math anymore. That's what I'm doing there. Analog summing can also do things like these individual channels have like thus and so of a slew rate, whereas this also has a slew rate. So the total slew of all of these channels would be them added to each other because it increases the speed. as you sort of sum up the different slews. And then the output slew could be another thing entirely. Or band limiting, like this frequency chart here. Each of these will also have band limiting, and the output will also have band limiting. A lot of wind and noise outside. And these are all things that analog summing does different. And the thing about that is if you've got band limiting on the bus, or band limiting on the channels, if you are in just open space, I'm really going to need to get a new pen. You're in open space, you were an ear, and these are sound generators. You're going to get high frequency limiting by the amount of distance you have between you and the sound source. You're going to get nonlinearities in the air as far as how the speed of sound transmits, and this is something I have not yet modeled successfully. There's going to be the way that the sounds combine will have different characteristics. The amount of air that it passes through will apply a frequency thing, and with digital summing, none of that is the case. With digital summing, you're always going to get exactly mathematical addition of these things as if they were being summed on the surface of your eardrum. So there's a reason why this stuff doesn't sound convincing. The actual output of audio sources being summed mathematically as if they were happening on the surface of your eardrum is not the same thing as if you had sources in air. And sounds are vibrations in air, not in math. But digital summing does not convincingly replicate summing of sound in air, much less sound in electronic consoles. And because of the band limitedness of consoles, it will get a little closer to the sound of summing in air than digital stuff does. I'm pretty sure what that's about. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on there. And it also has something to do with why, we often like using a lot of... I can shut this off because we're not using it. Actually, no, I just patched it in. Never mind. There's a reason we like things like transformer gear. Transformers are using a iron or steel or molybdenum or whatever lump of material and coils to activate it, and there are limits to the band pass that you can get through that. It by default uses a band pass. So that applies the same kind of effect that you get off of sound summing in air over an extended distance. It's like it makes it turn into a audio simulation of sound at some distance, whether that be 2 feet or 20 feet, 200 feet. Probably not 200 feet, but I bet there is some old gear which maybe rolls off the highs to avoid hiss that does accurately do 200 feet. So there you go. So I'm going to have to get back into scroll back again, because we got caught up in that. Scroll back more. We've got some talk about cables. Debate on cables and the impact in sound. Power cables. I can talk about this, certainly. You're going to have to put aside 24-bit for dither for the moment. Cables. Spending cash on cables. I can certainly talk about this. Here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to spend money on it, but paying attention is good. So, yep. Yeah, Joko was correct about the plugins have random noise thing. Ahmed is asking about making a distortion amp, not emulation. We'll get to that. I've made some updates in the Patreon future promises for higher patronage levels. And I feel pretty confident about that and how that's working, so we'll get into that. People will have made up their mind about cables, yes. But yeah. I think much of this chat is all about the cables and things and how they relate to things like Dither. It is super hard to keep track of all this. Bruno, I wonder if you are, if you're Bruno Pazzi's, please say so. You're probably not, though. In fact, I bet you're not, because Bruno would not be saying those things. Okay, we are getting a whole bunch of rapid scrolling. That's fine. People are getting caught up in a conversation about things. I'm real interested in testing out that mic at some point. I can't even see my levels at this stage, so woof. Woof is all I can say. Maybe I can fix that. Okay, I can fix it. Can't necessarily do that much about it though. Dum-dum. Don't mind me, just trying to make my rig work. And I'm also trying to hide my face. Because it is distracting, but I want to be able to see. Yeah, there we go. So if I can see my levels, then that shows me that I can raise my voice and I can tell whether I'm clipping out or not. Also, I'll follow up on Infinity 528 affirmation. Summing amplifiers is nothing but an amplifier here. All the summing amplifier is you added these together, mixed it through a resistor network, it made it be quiet. Summing amplifier just makes it be loud again. It's the same as any other amplifier. Like it's often bears similarity to a microphone preamp or something, because you're making really quiet stuff be loud again. But all a summing amplifier is an amplifier in this position. Now, I would amend that, because there is a, and this is probably more than you need to know, but if you start getting into DIY stuff, it'll become relevant. So you can make an amplifier. Let's see, how shall I draw this? It's an amplifier stage. And it can be a plus signal or a minus signal. On there, it can be inverting, meaning that it's coming in on the minus and going out as a plus, or non-inverting. If it is inverting, and you control its gain like this, it changes the geometry of the summing amplifier. This is where summing amplifiers, the topology of it matters. Because if it is just a coming in on the positive side, coming in as a positive thing without the negative feedback in this way, then the input impedance of the bus is going to be whatever the combined things are, and I think it'll be more interactive this way. But if you're summing it this way, with a inverting amplifier and then controlling the gain with negative feedback, that will force this input to be ground. So you got a floating ground situation where whatever is going on, the feedback part is going to try to push it towards ground, whatever it is. And that will make it, I believe in practice, that means it's able to handle more input channels, but it might be blender sounding. It's a little hard for me to specify because I don't know of anybody who has gotten really good at both figuring out the details of how that stuff works and explaining it to people. More often you'll get somebody like Rupert Neve who will build $1 million console and then sell that. And he's not that interested in being like, I chose to do this because this sound causes the liquidity of the highs to be thus and so. It's like, generally they're such heavy electrical engineers, they're not thinking in terms of adjectives. They're not thinking in terms of sound so much as they're thinking in terms of sonic requirements, bandwidth, noise, isolation of independent individual channels, stuff like that. So that is what summing amplifiers do. So we're on cables. I skipped ahead to cables. The thing is, like, cables, suppose these are wires hooking all of this together. Well, you could have a wire being much bigger and heavier than the other wires. That means it will carry signals much bigger than the other wires, which are already capable of carrying signals that technically will handle anything that you put through them, as far as, like, if they're not literally going to blow, like as in the trace burns off of the thing because you're giving it line level input. If it's not literally going to burn up, technically it's handling whatever it is you put through it. There's a catch. I have found in many cases, and maybe this is something which I should... is there a convenient way that I can dig something like this out? I'm facing away from the mic, sorry. Probably not. Let's not deal with it. I could take a stomp box off of my pedal board there and take the back off of it and hold it up to the camera and show you what's inside it. And it would work. Tell you what, I don't have to do that. You can probably hear me a little bit. I'm grabbing some stuff. I'll be right back. Let me grab one of these. And not this, but grab some of these. And let me grab this, because this is something I was wiring together. Here we go. Airwindows show and tell. You're asking me about cables. This is what I can tell you. Different kinds of gear have different kinds of wires on them. By the way, chat, you're going to go so far past me I won't be able to catch up. So far you haven't, but we started talking about cables and stuff starts blowing up when that happens. That's just understandable. So, back in the day, you'd have stuff like these. These are vintage capacitors. 15 microfarads, 50 volts electrolytic polar. As you can see, they have these wires on them. This is a fairly modern printed circuit where I wired this together. This is a clock. I mean to take the outputs off of these that drive the LEDs to make it a signal generator. and you put your little chip on there, and these are little resistors. These ones are actually unusually flimsy because this is a cheap clock from bought for like $7 off of China, so all the little parts are kind of garbage, and their tolerances are probably not very good, and the leads are flimsy. The leads are wobbly and flimsy. And these traces are flimsy because they're poorly made. There's not much material on these. There's just tiny, delicate amounts of copper because it costs money. And it's put on there like that. I don't know if I have other... Well, here. I'm in the middle of doing this and I have not successfully finished it yet, but as such I can still grab some of these. So this is a more modern and a more high quality circuit board. Like this is a cheap Chinese thing that was built to make a kit to show people how to solder a clock. However, the traces have space between them, and there's a certain amount of size to them, partly just, and you'll notice here, this goes to a battery, and for whatever reason, they decided that this should be wider of a trace than some of these other ones. If it's carrying power, that's sometimes what you'll do. Or you got like ground and voltage, and these are wider traces, partly because they have such a low quality trace here. I can't show you the size of these, but these are also resistors. You can't really see it, but if you could see it, you'd see that these resistors, like 1/8 watt and decent quality, the leads are thicker than on this resistor, which is as cheap as you could possibly get. This is a printed circuit board by Erica Synths. I'm in the process of trying to build these. This is where these came from. These are small diodes also from that kit. And again, you can't really see it, but this is more like a modern computer's circuit board. It's on at least 2 levels, maybe more. I'm not sure how many layers they've got in here. And the traces are a lot smaller than in the clock circuit board. I would love to be able to show you this, but I can't. If you take apart a old Moog modular synthesizer, you'll find the circuit boards are huge, and the traces on the old Moog circuit boards are giant compared to this, like this delicate little trace, and then the area of ground between it, which is basically there just to fill in space so that there's sort of shielding everywhere. The Moog traces will be the size of that for audio stuff, and they'll be tinned. They'll have solder float onto them, adding even more metal to the amount that is on that trace. The end result is taking a wire that could be like this or like this and making it kind of more like one of these wires. This is some of the kind of cable that the fancy pants people who are like, oh, you should have good cable. This is Monster. Monster is terrible. They will sue people that use the word monster in things. And I've got some kicking around because I just had it from somewhere. And I'll use it on stuff, but there's no special difference between that and do I have other cable handy? Kind of. Be right back. See, there's a bunch of stuff I have done, or that I do, or that I can tell you about in this area. This is not much better than this. It could be kind of different. No, I'm glancing at chat because there seems to be a fight breaking out. I will continue talking about cables, but oh, Bruno with the call out to Airwindows there. I've done stuff that adjusts the amount of dither, but it's not musically useful because it is a very fixed factor. Oh no, I hear that? I need to fix it. Okay, you can probably still hear me because this is a figure 8 mic. My phone always disrupts my world when I'm doing these things. I swear to God, I need to get rid of the phone entirely. I should never have a phone. It's nothing but grief. This is not much different than this, as far as getting away from this. And I've had experiences I can't show you because I don't... The one is built in my pedal board at the moment, and the other one I got rid of. But I had an analog man compressor, which is built on a bigger, heavier circuit board that looks a little more like this, except for with bigger, heavier traces. And one-sided. This is one-sided. Rather than one like this, which is many layered and all the traces are incredibly tiny. And I had two compressors, one of each kind. The analog man was kind of like this, and it was pretty close to being point-to-point wired. The traces were big and heavy, and the whole thing was not miniaturized. And the other one was from a company, Fairfield, and it was called The Accountant. And there were some very neat things about it design-wise. But the Fairfield Accountant was built like this. The circuit board for it was like this wide and this tall. It was the size of a large postage stamp. And the guitar would go into that, and the parts on it, like you can see we've got this big chip on here for the clock. The parts on the Fairfield were a lot smaller than that. Everything was absolutely tiny. And there were electrolytic capacitors. These are electrolytic capacitors. They're capacitors that have a larger range. And this is an electrolytic capacitor. As you can see, these are 22 microfarads. This is 10 microfarads, and I've also got some slightly larger ones. But you can see these are physically smaller. You can get them half the size or a quarter the size of these, but the more you go into that, the more you're putting some restrictions in much the same way that the size of the traces affect things. Let me put some of these back. And again, you can get into like the Moog, where the Moog wires are a lot closer to the size of this just on regular stuff. There's also people dealing with other things like this is a Eurorack power cable. But if you look at it, if you look at the edge of it, you can see that the individual wires of this ribbon cable are really flimsy. Like they're substantially thinner than this. They're closer to the amount of metal in one of these printed circuit traces and not necessarily one of the large ones. And one of the people that I use as far as modules is concerned, the guy from Blue Lantern, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but the guy from Blue Lantern has sometimes gone to some trouble to set up special wiring harnesses that have heavier cable conductors than what you see in these ribbon cables. These are a standard for Eurorack, and you can get the amount of energy through them. But he was of the opinion that stuff didn't sound as good as the bigger, older modular synthesizers, because the cables with which you're getting the energy, you're passing it through, were too thin and wimpy. Or here's another example, like these are some old potentiometers. They're the knobs. This is what we put knobs on. In fact, here's one that does have knobs on it. This is all Paul's from previous things I've built. And you can see that this one is wired up with some fairly heavy wire, and these are wired up with flimsier, thinner wire. And then you've also got sizes of wire like this. Or even, here is a cable that I made that handles RCA audio signals. It's not shielded, but it's got some peculiar things going on with it as well. Any cable you're supposed to... potentiometer should go back in there. I'm building to something with all of this. And let's put that back. Let me show you something that you probably haven't seen unless you're a refrigeration technician. Oh, wait. This cap could go back into this box, which is eventually going to go back. People talk about fancy wires and things. And I'm telling you about how some of that old gear is built like the Analog Man stuff is built like old gear. The super expensive Moog modular stuff is built like old gear. You can get things like cables, like this is a monster cable, which they made great fuss to putting together this cable, to having lots of very thin strands, and that's something you can't do with a cable. On the other hand, this is solid core. This is a single cable. When people make really thin strands, by the way, this is also made out of solid core. When people make really thin strands, the idea is they want to do stuff where the electricity is flowing along the outside of the conductor, because there's a thing called skin effect where like megahertz grade high frequencies will go faster along the outside surface than the inside of a conductor. So they go, well, we need to improve high frequencies. Never mind that that's not the most relevant observation. So we're going to have lots of really fine conductors, or they'll have things like there is a little piece of essentially rubber inside these connectors. So if you strip it, you wind up with the wire, but you also wind up with this little compressible part that is also included in the cable. It's not to make it more flexible. It's so that when you twist it up and then scrunch something down on that, you're also scrunching a elastic thing that's squishing back against the wires and holding them in place. So there are multiple things that you can do. And I mentioned skin effect as far as using lots of little conductors because of the idea that high frequencies go better along little conductors, which is true if you're willing to talk in the like megahertz range. But check this out. This looks a lot like one of those other things. Looks a lot like this, doesn't it? But it's not. This is regular, like, home electric wiring, heavy gauge solid core, like house wiring. It'll handle pretty much any voltage level that you would need. Anything that you're doing as far as speaker cables or whatever, this is not going to get you much above this. There might be a tone quality thing having to go on with it. It's hard to say. I don't lose a lot of sleep over that stuff. This is tubing. It is incredibly delicate copper tubing. And I bought it on Amazon for like about $6 or something. The purpose for that is that since it is copper tubing, it's copper, so it's a wire. But since it's tubing, I don't have to care about how good it is as tubing. It's called capillary tubing. But it'll have that hole through the center of it, even though it's about the size of heavy wire like this. It's somewhat more flexible but still pretty, you can work it by hand. But if you solder to it, it'll be easier to solder to because there is less material in here. So it'll heat up faster. You can solder something to the edge of it and be able to solder it kind of nicely and quickly. But since it's a tube, there's two separate skin effects going on. And I'm not the only person who has thought of using tubing for wire, but usually it's some kind of fancy audiophile company, and they'll charge you $6,000. This cost me, what, $5 for a little spool of this stuff? You don't have to spend money with the fancy audiophile people to do some of these things with cable. You can do some of those things with cable yourself. And you don't need their permission, you don't need their help. This is a cable geometry. You could do it with tubing. You could do it with wire that you bought because it was extremely fine strands, because you can buy that too. Just go to Belden, go to Mouser and start looking up Belden cable and pick how many conductors you want, and you're good. You can get it coated. You can get it tinned with silver. You can get it tinned with steel, tinned with copper. You can get multi-strand copper, anything you want. You can get silver wire and just buy it from the electronics wholesaler. You don't have to go to an audiophile company doing that. Silver has slightly better conduction. I don't know that that's necessarily particularly relevant. And this is a geometry. The idea here is if you have signal flowing through a wire, or like signal flowing back through a opposing wire, if they are going crossways, they don't affect each other. If they are going opposing each other, there's an inductance that will happen. They will tend to resist each other's flow somewhat. So the idea is to come up with geometries, and again, you can spend thousands of dollars from audiophile companies doing this, or you can build them yourself. This is a geometry designed to deal with that. You can buy expensive cables using exactly this geometry and spend lots of money, or you can get like some vinyl tubing like this, which I got at the hardware store, and build a cable like this if you really wanted to experiment with fancy cables. With this one, the ground signal turns around this way, and the hot signal turns around this way. So it's kind of like a coil, but at every point when they cross, there is a slight tendency of it to be like a coil, and so there will be some inductance there. But as they cross over, there is no inductance for the parallel cables going against each other. So this is a geometry that you can spend a lot of money on in the high-end audio thing. And yet, as you can see, I have built this for next to nothing. The wires were just sort of salvage discovery from places. And this vinyl tube I got at a hardware store, and I just soldered it up and twisted the wires around the right way. And it's the same thing. They're conductors, they're copper cables. The concern about like 99.999999999 purity copper, I don't think is that relevant. Nor do I think it's necessarily what you want. If you're looking for like magic vintage tone qualities and stuff, they were never doing ultra special copper for that stuff. Your magic antique gear is generally using regular old copper or even steel wiring. So, as far as cables are concerned, the trick with cables is having enough cable there to, because the idea, which I didn't actually get to, for using special cables, using heavier cables, using something that isn't just zip cord or whatever, is that some of your overtones, some of your transients and dynamics and things, you'll get more mileage out of them if the cable is wildly overspec'd. Like, imagine if you have a waveform Where'd my marker go? Here's my marker. So here we have the picture of an ear and sound quality things. And so imagine we have a waveform. And we've got this shape, and then it's going a bit up here because it's like a sawtooth or something. How much energy is in this? The answer is, how steep is this? If that is literally 90 degrees to silence, there is infinite energy in this because it is infinite slope and it's generating infinitely high frequencies. And this is the sort of thing that you don't experience in the real world. But that's where these cables come in, because if you're taking something like this and you're going like, okay, there's our waveform. I took some capacitors and some transistors, and this transistor happens to generate this. If I put it on a scope, it's actually producing in the megahertz because it's a transistor and it can do that. And that's what I'm putting through my audio, so here we are. If you're running that through a heavy wire like this, you can get a lot closer to infinite energy in this vertical bit. If you're running it through tiny little traces, like on the Erica Synth one, or the Fairfield Accountant, or anything that you do these days with this style of design, you're not going to get near to infinite energy from the purely vertical thing there. And this is one of the reasons why your vintage synth stuff that's made with this really primitive technology, and all the wires are kind of like big hunks of copper like this, or tinned circuit traces. That's why they have a particular kind of tonality, is because all their little parts are being activated and colored and touched by tone generators that really go way out there in how the energy works. And again, infinite slope requires infinite energy. If you're talking about a line level signal, and the line level signal is going between voltages like this, but it needs to transition from one voltage to another voltage at infinite speed, we wind up getting a result out of your heavier cables, stuff that will carry these basically invisible transients without distorting or having any effect on them. And that's what's been lost over the last 20 to 40 years of electronic design. That's what's been lost about how things have changed. Because it's also stuff like this. These capacitors are just a lot physically larger than what you use these days for doing that job. And the capacitor is composed of film with a metallized deposit on it that's wrapped around a lot. Sometimes they're non-inductively wound, sometimes they're inductively wound. And basically they're long, incredibly skinny wires with the material barely even there. And as you micro-miniaturize those, you're making the material inside them even more flimsy. So you go from something that's like a conductor like this to all your conductors like that. You go from the amount of signal that can go through a wire this size to all your wires being this size or even smaller. And we hear this as the difference between the vintage equipment and modern equipment. It's before you even get into digital stuff, because it's possible to do digital stuff that's still using analog stages like that. Some of the primitive old digital stuff works that way. That they're a lot heavier and cruder than modern stuff is made. So that's my take on the cables. Bottom line, you don't have to spend lots of money on boutique, expensive, unobtainium cables. But you do have to care about things like the topology of how the thing is wired, the size of your conductors, the ability to handle transients and energy way, way, way beyond what you would normally do. And this also touches upon the way that I design mixes and things. The idea of just not loudinating everything and taking away all of the peaks, because this also is communicated through peaks. When you get something like, and I also did not do a evergreens, I would have, but I had plug-in fixing work to do, and I had to do that instead. If you get something like, say, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, which I did a evergreens about, so that's available to patrons and you can hear it. You listen to that, and it just makes the hair raise in the back of your neck because it's amazing, but if you measure it, you find that the RMS loudness is way, way, way quieter than the peaks are. The peaks are huge. They're extraordinarily big, which again is because they're working with gear where the conductors inside the gear are posing no restriction on any of those peaks at all at any point. But it's also because the sound of human beings pushing themselves to their limits does tend to generate these funky overtones that are expressed in terms of bursts of energy. More energy for the performance, more energy for the peaks over RMS generally. So, it won't cost you money, but you have to know what you're doing. If you're building stuff, you build stuff in sort of your old school way, or simply build stuff in a way that you are not miniaturizing everything like it's meant to become a cell phone or something like that. You're building stuff that can adapt to musical situations where the energy being poured into it is really high. And again, by electrical engineer terms, that is wildly, wildly over-designing it. You give it more conductor than you would ever think that you would need, and you get some of the tone qualities of the classical gear out of it because that's one of the things that's different about that stuff. Sometimes really strikingly. I never forget the pictures of the uber expensive old Moog stuff where, and it's interesting how this works out too, because other people are capable of learning those lessons. Oh, David, good night. Go ahead and head back to bed. I'm so busy catching up with all of this. I haven't been able to catch up with what was going on. And yeah, my best wishes. Yeah, cables, conductors. I think we're about done with cables and conductors. Let me scroll up and see how much I've lost in the chat. People are asking some questions about that stuff. Yeah, we got a lot of scroll back. Tourette's wants to hear about my noise doesn't self-dither experiment, and yeah, it was. Rated cables, yep. Vectoroscopes, like oscilloscopes. Not sure what to say about that. Don't add noise just every time you use a plugin. Trust me to know what to do about that. Cable gauge, like compressors. Heaviest one that's conveniently usable. Like, I got this not for power wire. This is for audio circuits. I'm going to be building some stuff. I mean, it looks like just power cable wire, and this is extremely heavy and difficult to work with. This is tubing. This is for audio signals to pass through, not just for power to go through. Now, managing that becomes awkward and difficult, and I'll be working on that too. But yeah, there's no real limit on it. It's like, do what pleases you. And yeah, like strip things. Bo is on the right track there with like getting stuff and cannibalizing it for parts and things. Scrolling. Antenna cables have very low capacitance also. That's another thing that you can consider. But remember that capacitance is part of rolling off highs, and that's not necessarily your enemy. Power cables, same thing. Get cables that have conductors strong enough to handle what you're getting. I'm not sure to what extent that... Like some of the people that are fussing over this stuff, all of the individual components of their system are in the thousands upon thousands of dollars. Like I'm using some analog mixing stuff that's pretty decent. And one of the things about that is that it's running power supplies that are removed from the equipment. So it's running like DC power into the gear to get power supply stuff away from the audio things. And that's just as valid, if not more valid. But the power to those separate power supplies are still sort of like IEC cables. They're just the kind that you plug into the wall and stuff. It's generally going to be acceptable. Yeah, I do have a mount in the chat. Some of it's important, but trying to find stuff going on there. Yeah, condolences, dude. Trackers are cool. I like those. I have a tracker for the modular synthesizer that I'm not actually using, but I'm thinking about setting it up with the Kurzweil, because I got to figure out a way that I can use that Kurzweil more effectively. Okay, caught up with the scroll back. Yeah, so that kind of covers cables. Tell you what, it's 12:10. I got about a half an hour to go. Oh, you don't know what a tracker is? I'll draw a picture. A tracker works kind of like this. It's like a spreadsheet in which you type this stuff and it goes vertical instead of horizontal like sheet music. And the bit that you're on kind of goes down step by step. Trackers are typically quantized. I don't know of any trackers that like you can fudge the input of it. It's just click by click. And each time you go to a row, it sounds whatever notes are written in the column. Like this would be C4 and C3 and then C2. That's 3 different octaves of the note C. This is a separate column, so it's like a different track, and that's saying F7. So do and then a bit of a chord because there's this one and then this one. All a tracker is triggering sounds, typically samples, but it could be MIDI, by writing them into this spreadsheet. And you can do stuff like, okay, when you reach this point, you skip up here again. And so it's a little sort of 4-space loop. If there's nothing in there, it doesn't sound a note. Or you can write code in there, which it's like, if something is larger than 3, then skip back here or whatever. You can do sort of interesting things as far as programming the tracker to do stuff that is not purely linear, and that's interesting to me. But basically the idea of the tracker is you're just triggering whatever is in this column with whatever is in this note. And there's extra stuff like control voltages, volume, loudness. There's a bunch of different ways to transition from one note to another, one sound to another. It's basically like a little music computer that just starts firing it off. And it is kind of like a piano roll, except for that it's a piano roll where you can say, oh, by the way, this new note, slide to it. Don't just play the new note, slide from the previous pitch to the new pitch. And yeah, you can, piano roll is vertical. It's definitely vertical. Piano roll on a MIDI sequencer, something like Logic, is horizontal. A piano roll in a piano is vertical. So you can think of it kind of like that too. Also, a piano roll is note by note, and a tracker is instrument by instrument, or track by track. And you can also have other things which is like, okay, now switch this sample to this other one, and from this point on you're playing another sample. There's a lot of sophistication into it, but think of it like, it's your spreadsheet, and it is going from the top of the sheet to the bottom of the sheet and going like that. I'm reading the chat some more. Hope David feels okay. If you want to drop by on Wednesday for the Game Jam Hangout with folks, then by all means do that. Renoise is a key tracker as far as modern stuff is concerned. In fact, I'm not sure who else is doing a really modern, currently maintained tracker. Renoise is what you want. I have a copy of it myself. I've fooled with it, although I do a lot more music, live. But I did get into it and I find it interesting. With Renoise, you're going to need to have a bunch of samples. I do supply samples. Renoise is a DAW that is a tracker. I strongly recommend it. It's kind of like a Reaper-like project where it's a small number of people doing it. And it's not terribly expensive. You can also get freer or cheaper ones that are more emulations of the old school trackers. But keeping those maintained, running them on your system can sometimes be awkward, and using them is going to be more complicated than using Renoise. Renoise is way more up-to-date and current as far as it's just sophisticated as anything. There's a lot going on. Maybe Joku Sekovan hates Renoise. If that is so, hard luck, I like it. I don't know if Renoise existed in the 90s. Well, I still have some time, seeing as it's getting on towards the end of the day. It's going to be very interesting for me to hear this for the first time, seeing as I'm using a microphone that I've never yet heard, but that is so typical for me, honestly. It's always, I can hear my chair wonking out. Here, this is your new drum sample. Anyways. Oh, I doubt he really hates Renoise. I was just wising off. So here's what I wanted to bring towards the end of the chat. I'm putting together collections of things. We'll call them Airwindows kits. So I'm going to have a mix kit, a mastering kit, and while I am here, I'm going to throw out, I'll listen to you for some suggestions on kinds of things that you think would be necessary, That is not to say that I'm going to include them, but I'm interested to know. Oh goodness, no, I can't make anything like that, Ahmed. I'm interested to know what kinds of things you would find indispensable for such a kit, just so that I can get a better sense of, let other people into my process. It's going to be my process. It's going to be kind of like tape, where there's a version with everything, and then there's a version that is completely restricted to the way that I think things are supposed to go. And tape literally was designed to this purpose. Mixkit will include tape. I might make a plugin called Tone. I might make a plugin called Squish or Compressor or something, if I can come up with something that is sufficiently general, that's approachable, very little going on with it, and still flexible. I'm probably going to have a plugin called Reverb. I'm not sure if it would be necessarily like Pocket Verbs or Nonlinear Space. You can see a similarity here in that, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to just do what you say. This is, I'm looking for like what might I be overlooking that I would agree I'd be overlooking. It's probably worth having one called Gate. I've already got a plugin called Distortion. That's the one where you pick different distortions and apply them. And it kind of dropped by the radar or whatever, but that's the one where you can pick between a whole pile of different Airwindows clip styles. I've already got a plugin called Monitoring. I'd probably not be doing anything with peak limiters or clipping, because my concept for Mixkit is that this is the one where I tell you where to place all the plugins. And I go, okay, here's console goes here, and then this goes here, and then you go through tape, and tape catches your peaks, and then you go into monitoring, and monitoring tells you what you're doing. And then you mix stuff, and this is the level that you mix. Yeah, when you say compressors, the thing about that is which compressors? Oh, I'm not interested in doing a compressors bundle. That is too general purpose. I'll write it down as far as I gotta float the idea around in my head. But that's the idea, is like what stays engaged all the time. See, I'll write comp bundle down there. No, absolutely not. I would not put remap into this. Mixkit does not get remap. Remap is for expert users. Remap is not friendly to newbies. The idea here is you should get somebody who's like at the Fruity Loops or GarageBand level and be able to tell them, okay, put these things into these things into these things. This kind of sound should be about this loud. This should be like, here's your EQ, make it be, bassier or brighter or whatever. These are the kinds of things that you can do. Maybe brightness would be. I'll have a plugin that acts like a bright switch where you can dial in more bright on stuff, because that's so often I'll do it in such a way that it sounds actually good. I believe I can come up with some stuff that'll work that way. I've got certain algorithms that would be flexible as far as that's concerned. And Ahmed, you're failing to understand the concept, which is fine. That's why I'm explaining it. This is not a Swiss Army knife. New updates.zip is already a Swiss Army knife. I've got 180 plugins out there. Anything you could want is probably already accessible. I gotta start thinking in terms of how to make stuff more accessible for people so that people aren't just utterly lost. No Swiss Army knives of any kind. Any kind. I'm using tape instead of 2Tape6 for a reason here. 2Tape6 is pretty much just as good as far as getting tones, and it's way, way, way more flexible. But this is the one where you put it together You put the plugins where I tell you to, and mix through it, and it just falls into place. Everything just kind of works, and it has that Airwindows sound. It has a analog style sound, maybe even a like 70s band limited sound. And there is no confusion as far as like which blade of the Swiss Army knife you gotta pull out. This is about reducing choices. Mixkit is about reducing choices down to stuff where your fundamentals are taken care of. Which is why probably something like reverb, include something like reverb. I'll pull a likely thing out of Pocket Verbs and I'll go like, okay, this is the reverb you'll use. For Mixkit, you're going to want to do some kind of space, so this is the best space for you. And you pick that and you supply it, and then you give it to people who don't have a lot of experience. And if they go like, but I wanted another reverb, you go, okay, new updates is right over here. Nothing's stopping you from digging through that, pulling out individual plugins, and adding anything that you want. But this is a way to start people off where they can actually get into this and not be overwhelmed. Because right now, if you dump everything in newupdates.zip into your like components folder or VST folder or whatever and expect to know what the hell you're doing, it's completely useless. It will not work because it's just way too complicated. So the Swiss Army knife, that's what we've already got. We've got that now. Now where it gets interesting is the difference between that and Mastering Kit. Mastering Kit's super different. Mastering Kit is about, and monitoring cannot have a radio compression option. There's too many different things in there. Mastering Kit gets things like acceleration or bass kit or something. Mastering Kit gets stuff like biquad, or maybe biquad and then also biquad 1/2, on the assumption that you should know what those things are if you're mastering. You already know what a EQ band is. Mastering Kit would get AD clip, but maybe not AD clip 7, because AD clip 7 has those loudinator things built into it, and I don't think those are good. I've lost interest in that stuff. And Mastering Kit would have monitoring too, because monitoring is useful in both situations. But the idea with Mastering Kit is that rather than being like, okay, here's 2 tape 6, so throw 2 tape 6 and then fiddle with the controls, it's like, no. Instead, you have something that works like this often in 2 tape 6, and that would be acceleration. You'd have a bass enhancer that can build up subs like 2 tape, except for unlike 2 tape, it would be building up subs in mono like Bass Kit. But it might also have stuff like, you could build them up, but then you also have a EQ factor that perhaps is using a interleaved biquad, for instance, to cleanly cut out low frequencies in the side so that you have a dedicated like bass control thing that can sit on your mastering chain continually, but it has no extra stuff like the flutter. And granted, that stuff I have there so that it can be switched out. Like you can use 2 tape 6 in mastering and switch out the stuff that's not going to be relevant and have that work fairly well for you. But the idea is to have dedicated tools for these things. So, Mixkit, Mastering Kit. My question, firstly, is what kinds of things would be needed for this stuff? I suppose that I'm going to write comp limit in the Mastering Kit just in case, because I don't think mastering should be applying compression quite the same way. But depending upon what you're doing, those are very frequently parts of doing a mastering. And it's super related to what you've got coming in. Like, there are things where you would be doing full-on limiting and never doing clipping because the content that you're dealing with doesn't lend itself to clipping for level. And that's fine. But it needs to be a choice available in the mastering kit. Whereas in the mix kit, I'll just add bus comp because that's very relevant. That might be the name of a plugin. You'll have a plugin, it'll literally be called bus comp, and it'll be like a simplified version of Logical 4 or something. And, well, Baxandall could very easily go into Mixkit. I just wonder whether it is simple enough calling it Baxandall, since people might not necessarily know what one of those are. Like, it certainly would fit a mastering kit because you are expected to know what something like that is. So I'll write that in there. You figure that people recognize that word? That you can see a plugin called Baxandall and, oh, that's the EQ. That's like the bass treble EQ. Because as far as just a tone shaper is concerned, it's pretty much perfect for Mixkit. That's like exactly what you'd want for Mixkit. Because it's a broad stroke EQ. That might be enough, honestly. Part of the lesson of learning it, and it'll be helped by the fact that Mixkit, either of these, but Mixkit especially, it's got to be small. If you install everything and you look into your little Airwindows folder, it's got to be a pretty limited number of things, and you know what they are by looking at them. That's a big problem with the 180 plugins that I've got, is you can't remember what everything is. But Baxandall is an odd enough name, maybe people will remember that. It's like, oh yeah, it's a tone control. So maybe we'll just include it, and we'll call that another default in Mixkit. Because one of the things about it is that as far as like amateur mixing is concerned, it's pretty ideally suited because you will not get yourself into as much trouble with it. Like, it's a tone control. You roll off the bass and it rolled off the bass. You roll up the treble and it rolled up the treble. It basically does what you ask it to do, rather than like something where it's like, oh, I've got more Q. Q sounds cool. Q's the guy in the James Bond movies. Let's give it all the Q. Why can't I hear what it's doing? And then you wind up with some kind of crazy boost and weird stuff starts happening in your mix. Or it starts tweaking out your compression because you've got something poking out of a very high Q boost somewhere. Some of that stuff you can get into trouble if you don't know what you're doing. Baxandall is a lot harder to get into trouble with if you don't know what you're doing, and that's what I'm shooting for in Mixkit. It is an introductory thing. And it is also a stop thinking about little details of the tech thing. It's I'm recording music, I'm thinking about the performances, or I'm thinking about the songwriting. And the sophistication that I need to get into with tone controls is like, does it need to be brighter or not? Let's turn up the brightness on Baxandall. And that's the idea there. I think there's going to be a lot of relevance to that, because one of the things I'm going to try to encourage with all of this, maybe not so much with mastering kit, because that's a very different scenario, but that's why you'd have different variations on a biquad filter. Is with mastering kit, you'd be using smaller numbers of things, hopefully, but you'd be selecting them very intentionally. You would compare Baxandall with what you'd be able to get out of a biquad and what you'd be able to get out of the interleaved biquad, and you would pretty much remember, like, they'll all be under the B, like Baxandall biquad and biquad 1/2, they're all under the B, so that's cool. But Mastering is where you would be paying attention to that and auditioning different variations to see what you get, or maybe using different ones at the same time. I mean, they're all running dithering to the floating point bus, so you can stack them up pretty good. And mastering is also where you do different kinds of loudness control. So different speeds of loudness. I'm writing surge in here because that's a very slow. So I'll have an advice for the mastering as far as like, here is the slow to fast quality of how you're handling your gain levels here. And your surge or surge tide is acting like an automatic gain control, and it's very subtle and it's very pure. And then we've got some compressors that are increasingly fast or limiting or whatever. And then here's a clipper, it's even faster, and with the combination of all these things, you can get the dynamic picture that you want out of a mastering. It's not all about just making stuff be louder. And everything will have to have wet dry, obviously. Especially for these comps. So let me write that down as well. Mastering kit, there will need to be new things for some of these things. But all these comps have to have dry wet available because it needs to be, you can fiddle with various things in order to let the peaks back through again to make them behave properly. So yeah, I am getting, this is good, I'm getting some additional information. You'd be able to throw things on like monitoring and throw on like subs only and then tweak the dry wet of different compressors to let more punch through in the lows, and ideally just switching around and dialing things in so that it starts really acting like and giving you the sound you want and doing what you want out of it. So yeah. So we're going pretty good. There's the thing. I've got additional notes. I'm going to be needing them. Hopefully I can get some of these things as far as new. I know that Ahmed was asking me about what's the next plugin. I couldn't begin to tell you. There are some plugins that are going to be coming out. I'm going to be filling in with the original character plugins because there are some people who need and want them. Those are not going to be like up to speed currently plugins, but they're sort of filling in the retro quality. People who have really, really, really old mixes from more than 10 years ago who need to bring them up to speed. I do have a Transient Designer plugin, and it is out. I need to write it into the mastering kit, not necessarily anything else. Probably the mastering kit. And it is, what the hell was it? Oh, me. Spike? Did I have one called Spike? Let's go and look in there. And yeah, Kevin, mix and mastering kits are forthcoming. Forthcoming is a broad word, though. Fifth coming, maybe. Sixth coming. Let's go to Airwindows, and I'm going to look into my categories, and I'm going to tell you which one is the Transient Designer. And then I'm going to write it down so that I have it written down. It'll be under Compressors Plus. I'm going there right now. And I'm going to scroll way the heck back. Point. Point is dangerous. I'm going to need a better version of Point. But, mastering kit. So I'm adding that to both of the lists. But it's out. It is just in a form where it's kind of dangerous and crazy. You can use Point very aggressively. You can use Point in such a way that it blows up your mix pretty good. So you may already have it. It certainly exists in newupdates.zip. Go and reacquaint yourself with Point. And as far as the Transient Designer is concerned, that is the thing that will do that for you. I feel I need to revisit it. I should do better as far as Point is concerned. It's a really old and effective one, but yeah, be careful with it. It is a very powerful transient designer, shall I just say. It's ruthless. It can explode. It can also make things like snares explode, so that's pretty cool. Uh, if I revisit it, it'll be in such a way. Well, yeah, I mean you can make like 90 dB spikes over what you're already doing. You can blow the roof off of your mix with it. Yeah, yeah. It's. I need to make a safer version. But if you want the Swiss Army knife version, I might even be able to increase its range somewhat in certain ways. But yeah. Point is one of those chainsaw tools. You can do completely crazy things with it, but it's not easy to use. I should be able to make it a little easier to use. It'll be worth revisiting at some point. That'll be in a more inspired week where I've got my feet under me a little bit better and things have settled down and become a little bit more smooth, where I'm a little more used to how these things are working. But yeah, looking good. Any last minute questions? Because it is 12:39. I promised 12:38, so it's getting about ready to log off. I'd love to be able to pipe the chat into this text file thing there. I think I zapped myself with Point in the video. I did the re-release of Point, and I managed to slam it so hard that I had to edit the post-processing like because I did something where it just freaking exploded. It just exploded. It blew my ears out. The headphones almost blew. So yeah, be cautious with Point until I figure out ways of sorting it out. We'll save that. Q and Q, yeah, it is Q and Q because like you've asked me questions, but I've asked you questions, and hopefully that's how this is supposed to work. I'm never afraid when things go into this sort of weird dark place where people are climbing all over me on the forum posts and stuff, people flaming me like crazy and yelling and complaining and stuff, because that's an opportunity for me to like be gentle, but it's also an opportunity for me to figure out what it is that they need or what bits are just completely blowing it for them. It's not my job to make people be gentle for me. Instead, it's my job to be able to work out what the reality is behind somebody having an emotional reaction. Because like the bigger the emotional reaction, the more likely it is that there's something there that I could benefit from paying attention to. Yeah, as far as critiquing people's mixes, Kevin, I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. That did not end up being the thing where there was a lot of traction to it, nor do I necessarily think that it is the best use of me doing stuff. It's probably better for me to do stuff in the way of these mix kits and stuff, and if I feel like I should be telling you how to do mixes, what I should do is give collections of plugins and instructional videos. Like, rather than critiquing people's mixes, I could do an instructional video with like, I'll do one in Reaper and I'll do one in Logic, and then I'll be kind of out of luck because I don't have many more. I'll do one in Renoise and try to put together stuff where it's like, this is how you use this tool with the Airwindows plugins to get a Airwindows style mix out of it. And that kind of thing, that would take me all week to do. That's not something that I can just blow off in an afternoon between doing plugins. A lot of these things, and this is what got to me at the end of 2019, a lot of these things require my attention. They require me to take them seriously. But it could be worthwhile. It's gotten to the point where just giving new plugins isn't as useful as being able to facilitate people using them. So with that, fiddle with my connections and things a little bit. Seems legit. And I will say sounds back on. Yeah, I told you about how I was trying to fix, plug in new microphones and stuff. This is just the kind of stuff I deal with. I have to learn how to do these things. I switched away from the scene in which there was the mic. Oh, yeah, everybody's now saying it. Yeah, I'm back. I'm back. I switched away from the scene in order to be able to fade out your chat there. Oh, everybody's freaking the hell out. Yay. Oh, that's funny. Um, and I'm talking merrily away about the cables and things. And I was using the new mic input, which is not in all of my scenes. So, yeah. I think that's a good enough reason for me to log off and say I'm done for the day. Which is not to say that I'm truly done for the day, because I got lots of other stuff to do. But I'm done with the stream for the day. So I will finish by stopping talking and bid you good night. So, good day.